China, big tech, free speech. The world is changing. We're moving toward the end times. What do we need to know? International business leader James Lockett says we need to look at the world through a different lens. Find out what he means in this week's TGIF at Work podcast. How do I bring my faith to work? How do I tap into the power of God in my work-life call? Why am I going through this adversity? Is God mad at me? I'm Hillman, and I've been helping leaders like you answer these questions and more for over 30 years. That's what this podcast is all about. Let's learn and grow together. Welcome to TGIF, Today God is First. Well, welcome to this week's TGIF at Work podcast. It's a really special opportunity today to visit with a longtime friend. Man, we've known each other for a long time, back in the 80s. And James Lockett is with me today. And, tell you a little story about James. Back when I went through my crisis and my very important meeting that I had with Gunnar Olson in Washington, D.C., 2 years into my crisis, I met with Gunnar, but there was a man sitting next to him, and that man was James Lockett, and James was on the board of the International Christian Chamber of Commerce. And so James and I have gone back, way back, and James has traveled the world and lived in different parts of the world. And that's why I wanted to have him today to give us a perspective that many Americans can't have, because we haven't lived in other parts of the world, especially Muslim parts of the world and China and different places. So, James, welcome to our podcast.
It's so good to see you again, Oz, and thanks for inviting me here. Yeah, it has been a long time. I remember so well when we were meeting, and then back in the 90s, I guess it was probably 96, that you asked me to introduce you to Gunnar after you and I had met. And yeah, you want to tell that little story again too? You thought we were kind of insulting. You poured your heart out, and we started laughing. Do you remember that?
I do remember that. You guys, when I told my 2 years of woe, you kind of looked at each other and began chuckling, and I didn't know whether to slap you or walk out or what to do with that.
You probably should have slapped us. That would have been good. But yeah, the laughter was because we had, by that point, 10 years into the ministry of ICCC, we had seen hundreds, even thousands of people with similar types of stories. And it's what we call the valley experience. I know you're one of the great teachers out there in the marketplace ministry, so they've heard your version of it. But yeah, that was funny, and it was of course good to be able to console you afterwards. We're laughing in the Holy Spirit with you, rejoicing at the end of the valley experience and going to the mountaintop again.
Absolutely. And that was such a strategic meeting in my life, because Gunnar pulled out a napkin and said, here's where you are, here's the next stage, and here's the next stage. But the key is pressing into the Lord. And little would I know, the Lord would use that adversity and take me to 26 countries and write 21 books. And we're still all connected, and we're not in jail or anything. And so God's still using us.
Yeah. So it's exciting to just to continue to walk with God and see the different doors that He has been opening. But yeah, really excited to now. Speaking of moving around a lot, as you know, my wife and family moved from China back to the United States about 2.5 years ago. So I'm back for another season in the United States, actually in the Phoenix, Arizona area. So.
Yeah, I want people to get a sense of who you are and the experience that you have, to be able to speak from an informed perspective as an American that lived overseas and experienced all the culture that you did and the challenges. Just give us a little snapshot of the various positions. Your background is law, but you've worked in world economics and governments, the U.S. government, the Chinese government. I mean, you've got a resume that's quite remarkable. Tell us a little bit more about that.
And it wasn't by design. So all this sort of thing, there were
Never
things.
is it?
Yeah. Well, you know, God gives you the desires of your heart, and so you seek first the kingdom, you seek first His righteousness, and all these other things are added. And you know, He puts talents. You know, we teach about the parable of the talents. Each one of us gets individual talents. I always had a passion for justice, and so as a kid, I wanted to be, you know, doing something around the globe. There's a story behind that, but I in law school absorbed everything that I could, and then I became a Christian also during law school, and so things began to change. Even though I didn't get very churched, Oz, but uh, and I prayed and asked God what I should study. I decided to do a master's degree in international law over in England, so that was my first overseas adventure, and I prayed, and God told me what appeared to be a very stupid set of courses to study. So one was European Union law, one was international trade law, and one was Chinese law. And I don't know if you can imagine, but as an American lawyer, why would someone study international trade law? There was no WTO at the time. This
Hmm.
was before the WTO existed. European Union law, which this is back in the 80s, early 80s. So the European Union wasn't very important. And Chinese law, well, a couple of years earlier, China, I mean, they weren't even open. And some people wonder still to this day, is there such a thing as any Chinese law? But God told me to study those, and I did. And then I moved back to the United States and had a couple of years legal practice in Seattle, where I'm originally from. And then I determined to go back. I didn't feel like I was fulfilling what God had told me to do. So we moved back to Europe, back to England. And in the church I was in, I thought I was being prayed for to just go to England for a couple of years and then come back. And someone prophesied over me and said this would be the first of many nations to which I would go. And I
Hmm.
didn't really believe it, but as you and I are talking, it's now 87 nations. So it's been interesting. But the first assignment after London, so one of these sneaky things that happens, you go thinking head to England with two suitcases, and I was supposed to support myself with a part-time job with an American law firm. Well, guess what? They closed their office,
Hmm.
and bank they were working for Bank of America back in the day, and Bank of America went through a crisis, and the law firm's London office got closed with Bank of America's London office closing. So I had no job and two suitcases and didn't know where to go. Looked on the bulletin board of the London School of Economics where I had been studying, and there was an advertisement from a Belgian law firm looking for an English speaking lawyer with an interest in China. Oh, wait a minute. 3 years earlier, God had told me to study European Union law, international trade law, and Chinese law.
Hmm.
And so I got pretty excited, obviously. Um, Cut the long story short, the managing partner came over to London a couple of weeks later, interviewed me, and he hadn't read my resume very carefully. His jaw dropped and he said, "When can you start?" And I was in Brussels 2 weeks later. So I spent the first 14 years of my career in Brussels, Belgium. And I moved from being a young lawyer, and God bless me, I just did my very best. I moved from there to being a partner in two of the top 20 law firms in the world. It was really quite amazing. But in that process, a year after I arrived in Brussels, I was introduced to a Swedish businessman who, to this day, is a mentor of you and I. This was back in 1984. His name was Gunnar Olsen, and he'd been sent by God to find a Christian lawyer in Brussels.
Hmm.
Well, to find out there had not been a Christian lawyer in Brussels until I had arrived 10 months earlier. And so Gunnar and I began to work. And so I initially was the lawyer for the International Christian Chamber of Commerce. And then to my astonishment, because I was about, I think, 31 years old, just a kid, uh, Gunnar asked me to be a founding member and the secretary of the International Christian Chamber of Commerce. So that began 15 years. As much as I'm doing my professional career, working, as you can imagine, what it takes to be a partner in a top 20 law firm, the dedication to do that. I'm also spending 15 years on the board of the ICCC, moving and helping it expand across, I think, probably about 45 or 50 countries at that point. So, and a lot of great stories. I learned how to walk by faith, as you and I have experienced. The mentorship that Gunnar has given, and the work of walking by faith. But that's kind of the first phase of my career. So that's a long answer to give folk a little bit of background. But that was really about listening to the Lord, and daring to do things that you heard Him speak that maybe didn't fit into your understanding. And so I like to tell that story. I think it's instructive for a lot of people.
Absolutely. It's fascinating and inspiring to know that how God has prepared us even before what that we don't know about, of what our future is going to be, and building things in us that we need, and not realizing what's ahead for us. So
Yeah, and that storyline has repeated itself 3 or 4 times in my life. So there's another version of that story 20 years later. So death and resurrection again, Oz. We know that story, and I've had the death and resurrection story play out in my life a lot of times. But
I'm
okay,
getting kind of tired of it. I'd like to move on past that part.
yeah, yeah. So phase two is professional suicide. So I heard God telling me, you are to resign as a partner in the top 20 law firm, and move to Sweden to open the international office of the ICCC and work for free. And this is like, you get your dream, you've made it to the mountaintop, and then God tells you to go down into the valley again. Um, so I prayed long and hard about that. I talked with Gunnar about it. What I didn't know is that Gunnar was crying in his heart to have a lot of the the ministry had grown really big, and it was crushing him. And so I just became the answer to Gunnar's prayer without him asking me. So I did that. That was, and so many people told me not to do it. But I moved to Sweden and opened the international office, which still functions to this day. We expanded the ICCC from about 45 countries to 65 countries in those 2 years. So it was an amazing time. We put a lot of structure. I put my legal skills to work there, as well as managerial skills. And it's another Valley thing, Gauze, because the professional suicide, after I finished those 2 years, the Lord moved me to Washington, D.C. And I then got a job as a senior counsel for the United States government in the Commerce Department. And one of my childhood dreams about being an international lawyer, I dreamed about, kind of representing the United States. And the way my career had gone close to that, but never got there. But within 2 years, I was actually a legal counsel for the United States in Geneva at the World Trade Organization in a dispute. So I was handling disputes, and I had this just amazing experience of standing up one morning and saying, "Good morning, my name is James Lockett on behalf of the United States of America." I mean, that was like just a surreal experience. So again, it's death and resurrection, and professional suicide took me to the fulfillment of a childhood dream. Uh, so that was fascinating. I did a lot of work for the U.S. government, and they sent me out to Indonesia to train the trade ministry. I worked in Vietnam, and then phase three happened. So I actually made a mistake. And I think God's plan A for me at that point was to do something, but I made a mistake. I fouled up a little bit like people do sometimes. And I went off on a plan B. The plan B was God moved me to China and resurrected all this strange Chinese law thing. So I then worked in China for 6 years for China's largest uh, privately held company, the largest telecommunications company in the world, a company that's now not allowed in the United States. So it was really pretty controversial. And so there's a lot that we could talk about there. And I'm now in the fourth phase. So I've left that opportunity, and God is now instructing me to really more serve the body of Christ. I'm coaching and mentoring CEOs who want to do international business, global business, and so it's been the same sort of story again and again. So a pretty long answer, Oz, but uh, I think people need to, be able to trust God, listen to God, and hear God, and even without the understanding, just seek first the kingdom of God and His righteousness, and all these other things will be added unto you.
Mm, that's awesome, and what a broad amount of experience. But one of the things that speaks to me about that is that you had your own um, Abraham Isaac moment of putting the knife in a career voluntarily.
Yeah,
And when you did that, little would you know that God would honor that in other ways by bringing you into a much larger place of influence. So I hope that everyone listening or watching this catches what you did, because that's, and I think we learned that from Gunnar, how he gave his business to the Lord and how he, one day gave all his money away. That was a remarkable story that he did, that's in his biography. But that's the journey, that if you want to be a kingdom leader, uh, that God will bring you to that place at times to give up everything for Him, for His purposes, and He will measure it back to you. Well, I know many people would love to know, with China being in the news so much, what in the world was it like living in China for 6 years as an American married to a Chinese, and you adopted the son, right?
yeah, yeah. So I'm a father of a Chinese boy and husband to God connected me with a Chinese widow. So her first husband had passed from a tumor about a year and a half before we met. We were introduced by a woman who was in uh, uh, the church that I joined. But yeah, it was fascinating. And, I had lived in England, I had lived in Belgium, I had lived in Sweden, I'd lived in Indonesia, I'd lived in Vietnam. Vietnam is a little bit like China. They would be, they would hate it if I characterize it that way, and vice versa. They're two very independent countries. But yeah, living in China is and in Vietnam, the probably the two largest, most prominent, what we call communist countries today, is really a different experience. The control that comes from the government, uh, and the overlay of communism on top of traditional beliefs in China, Confucianism, Buddhism, and so forth. So it is amazing. And on the other side, I got to see behind the curtain. We talk about the different types of curtains. What God is doing in China,
Mm,
and the public perception that we see in America is typically the Communist Party and the control and so forth. That's very real, and that we could talk about that if you'd like. But behind the scenes, there's a whole different dynamic. I think most people would not be really aware, for example, that there are more Christians in China than there are Communist Party members.
mm,
Think about that. And the number of Christians is approaching the number of Christians that statisticians say we have in the United States as well. But God is definitely on the move in China. At the same time, Xi Jinping, the current leader in China, has been ratcheting the controls and tightening back more towards the Mao system, how the economy works. He's kind of let the tiger out of the cage, though. Deng Xiaoping, an earlier Chinese leader, did that in the late 70s and early 80s. And where I lived was Shenzhen. It was actually the first special economic zone, the first place where China liberalized. So the city of Shenzhen is now China's third largest city, and it didn't exist in 1980. It's now 16 million people, if you can imagine that. If you can imagine a city the size of New York or Los Angeles suddenly popping up over the course of 30 years or so, it's quite extraordinary. And
I remember a few years ago where 60 Minutes did a story on a whole city that was built and had no people in it, had shopping malls and had no people in it, had no businesses in it.
yeah,
Is are people in that place any yet?
yeah, I mean, they are. And, China is absolutely massive. It's about 4 times bigger than the United States population wise. And that size of the population affects who they are. I think just to make an analogy, I think we could talk about the differences between China and the United States. But one of the things is, and not to insult people in New York, for example, but think about how people in New York, if you go on the street in New York, or you go on the streets of a city, a small town in Georgia, Oz, um, are the people in New York more friendly, or are the people in the small town in Georgia more friendly?
Well,
Everybody knows that one. It's the small town people are more friendly. Um, and I think as we get pushed together, this I've noticed in heavily populated countries like Indonesia, where I also lived, and in China, people just kind of close up a little bit more than they do when they're in a smaller environment where people more easily know. So I think that just the size of the country sort of affects the mentality. It is a very real thing, but yeah, living in China was really interesting. Again, I had constantly this contrast between the public perception, the Chinese control, and being watched by the police, being spied on by the government. I think I was probably spied on by the U.S. government and the Chinese government because of who I am. But uh, uh, you sort of get used to that. But your average Chinese person on the street is very friendly. They see a white guy, going by. I had people smile at me and wave at me and very friendly. And I had a good reception from the Chinese government when I had a chance to talk with them. Uh, so they were very welcoming of someone with an international experience. But I was working for Huawei Technologies, is the largest telecommunications company in the world. I had kind of a hybrid lawyer and government relations. So I was basically a fireman for them. I had to put out problems in different parts of the world and solve issues for them. And I also represented them. And this is the other interesting thing, because remember that this part of my life is a plan B. I had disqualified myself to do something else. And then once again, God took me to a place where most people looking at my life would say, wow, you reached the highlight of your career. Because when I was at Huawei, I went to the World Trade Organization, gave keynote speeches at major events. And on behalf of Huawei, I was sent to the World Economic Forum. People talk about Davos. I was sent to they have about 10 or 20 different little think tanks. I was sent into the World Economic Forum think tank on trade and investment around the world. Ostensibly, the top 10 or 15 people in the world are put together in this little club to think about that, and they do the same thing in multiple issues. So I've been like it's sort of like being a spy, Oz, and we could talk about how China and America spied on me, but God through me and certain other people that have been sent into places like that. We've been spying on the world systems to get some insights. So it was. I look back on this period, which I left about 2 years ago, but I look back on this period and really see so many contrasts. But yeah, I think what I notice in America, a lot of rhetoric, anti-Chinese rhetoric, and I would hope that we could actually focus that rhetoric. There is a right focus on the Chinese Communist Party, but not China. And remember that there's, between 100 and 130 million Chinese Christians who are actually praying for us. They were praying for our election. They love America. They love Americans. And that number of people is bigger than the number of Chinese Communist Party people.
Do
And
you have any idea whether any Chinese party members are getting saved?
yeah, there are some, definitely. Of course, they couldn't talk about it so much, and they wouldn't be invited to the Communist Party if it was known that they were Christians. But of course, God is in the business of saving people out of situations that they get in.
Mm,
And I mean, think about it, there's 90 million Communist Party members. Now that's in a country of 1 point something billion.
mm.
So 90 million is like it's peanuts, really, but that still is a lot of people. And I talked to a lot of them because I met dozens and dozens, even hundreds of Communist Party members, and for the most part, when I would talk to them, I would ask them, well, when did you join the party and why, and what does it do for you? And they would say, well, it's kind of like a club membership. You get a VIP membership. If you join the party, you get better information. You might make some friends who can get you promoted in your job. It gets you on the inside track. And it's sort of expected when you reach a certain level that you'll pay your dues and join the club. And I mean, that could be the Rotary Club, right? I mean, just to
Chamber of Commerce.
the local chamber of commerce. So I think, yeah, I couldn't put numbers on it, but I would guess the majority of people who are CCP Chinese Communist Party members probably fall into that kind of camp. Um, and then there are some, I mean, in Beijing at the really senior levels, that's the hardcore communists, and I met some of those types of people as well, and they have a vision to make China number one, just as the United States has a vision to keep the United States as number one. China, on the other hand, for 2,000 years has been the largest trading country in the world. 100, they sort of lost that position. The United States has operated for 100, 150 years as the largest trading country in the world. And the Chinese see that as sort of an aberration. They had 2,000 years of doing it. We have 137, I think is the number, since we became the largest trading country in the world. And they just want to be back to number one. To them, it seems natural. To us, it seems like we're at war, where it's a threat. Um, and so that's a lot of the tension I see. We just finished an election in the United States. There was a lot of rhetoric about that. And, I have good friends still in government, people that I worked with who are, virulent anti-Chinese. And I would hope people could take a little bit more long-term and nuanced view of that. Of course, we know from God's perspective, God raises up nations. He decides the length of those nations for different reasons, many times according to the righteousness of the nation and the plans and purposes of God for people. So um, I just, after having lived there and seen the people and the inside and the hearts of many Chinese people, you know, very sophisticated. One of the founders of Huawei, as much as we say they're like a public enemy, one of the founders of Huawei is also a Christian, and it's a privately held company. And I'm not here to defend them or anything. That's not my point. Just to add some nuances, and let's try to avoid some of the stereotypes that we hear and see so much.
Were you touched at all by the human rights abuses of China? Like, we've been hearing a lot in the last year about the Muslim crackdown and things of that nature, and the camps that have taken place, and some of the testimonies from somebody who just actually went through it and was a horrible experience.
Yeah, I don't have personal experience with that Muslim area. I didn't have a chance to travel to that, but my wife being Chinese, we get a lot of information from inside of China, and of course, I read a lot about it, have talked to people about it. So it is very real, and the Chinese, uh, let me put it another way, like in the story. I learned a lot. I have a 16-year-old Chinese son, and until 3 years ago, he was raised in the Chinese education system. So he's been brainwashed like every Chinese kid for the most part. His mother's a Christian. I'm a Christian. His grandfather is a Christian. So he's probably got a different perspective than a lot of people, but still, he's been going through the system. And he's a good indication to me of what the average Chinese thinks, because that was what he was taught from age 0 to 13. And uh, they're pretty much taught the same about Muslims and Christians. Those are two groups that have strong beliefs in God, and that God is a different God than the Chinese Communist Party. So both of them are a threat to the regime. But the Muslims, because they have been more aggressive, uh, uh, the Christians tend to be more peaceful. The Muslims, and I'm making really gross, big generalizations there. Um, so they have a strong view. They really dislike the Muslim religion, and so the Muslims in the far west of China, in those areas, do face really real persecution. That is a very real issue. And China is not, uh, because of their size, and also the fact that they're a dictatorship. Uh, they're not thinking that much about human rights. They're thinking more about efficiency and control and how to keep things in a good, orderly system. And most importantly, for the Communist Party, that they have to stay in control. So they view the Christians and the Muslims as a threat to their control, for sure.
How do you see the future of Hong Kong and Taiwan?
Yeah, probably differently. I think Hong Kong, when it was transferred by the British back to China, and if you read the terms of the lease, that was a definite transfer of sovereignty from. Turn that off. Um, that was a definite transfer of sovereignty with a schedule. And so for us to think that it would be turned away or made different, I think they are going to be absorbed by China, and the Chinese are seeing that to be in their interest. Taiwan is a very different issue. That's still where the Chiang Kai-shek, the original leader of China, who was overthrown by Mao Zedong, moved to and resides. So again, that's Muslims, Christians, and Taiwan are on the top of the hit list for the Chinese Communist Party. But the United States has drawn a very clear line. China knows that it would be the worst kind of war ever if it made a move on Taiwan, and so I don't think we'll see. They have to save face. They have to continue to say Taiwan is part of China, and we're going to come and get it. But I don't think they ever will make that move. So I think that the status of Hong Kong and Taiwan is a bit different there also.
I could see where Trump would stand up to it, but do you think Biden would even stand up to him if they made a move?
Yeah, unlikely. Especially with what we know. I won't get into all the Hunter Biden story, but and their links to China, and probably the hooks that China has in people. And the Chinese are very good at embedding long-term hooks and calling them in when they need to. So um, you know. It's also just a different approach. I was actually in the U.S. government in the Obama administration, or Bush and Obama, and serving out some of their policies. So I was actually serving out U.S. policies when Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State. Also, we got similar ideas. So I have reasonably good idea from the top in terms of what the foreign policy objectives are in Asia. It's more about the kumbaya movement, hold hands, be nice together, and that doesn't work so well with two groups of people. Again, with the Arabs and with the Chinese. The Arabs and the Chinese admire strength, they admire force. They're outcome determinative rather than moral determinative. And so when you're trying to deal with that kind of people, I wouldn't say a Trump method is good, but coming from a position of strength, and we have to define strength from God's perspective. But the Chinese, we could go into a little story about Trump and Xi Jinping early on in the Trump administration, if you want. But I think
I think that's worth sharing.
yeah, okay, let's do that one. So, because I think it kind of answers your question. So, early on in the Trump administration, he and the leader of China, his name is Xi Jinping, wanted to meet together, and Mr. Trump invited him to his Florida home in Mar-a-Lago. And when Xi Jinping arrived, they were supposed to have an opening lunch, and Mr. Trump was at the time dealing with some pretty serious issues in Syria. This is in the springtime of his first year in office, so that's 2016, and they were due to get together. Trump was getting intelligence about the possibility of being able to take out a number of pretty serious, made the news, so people might remember this, some pretty serious missile strikes that were taken to take out a number of high-level Muslim terrorists. And all this came to a point right at the time that Trump and Xi Jinping were supposed to have lunch. So this, as the story goes, and this has been repeated, verified both in China and in the United States, Mr. Trump came and said to Mr. Xi Jinping, I know we're scheduled to have lunch right now. This meeting is super important to me, but I'll tell you what I'm going through. And then he told him very bluntly that he was facing an opportunity to take out some real major bad guys in Syria, and he had to take the decision because the intelligence had a short window, and the window was lunchtime. So he said, with all due respect, I'm going to have to leave you alone for lunch. I will come back for dessert, and then we'll talk. So he went off, and then he authorized the strike. I think there were 7 different strikes or missiles or something, and it was a very successful strike. Then he came back and explained to Xi Jinping the thought process he had gone through to pull the trigger, because that's a very, high level but very risky endeavor to do that sort of thing. It was successful finally, and he explained his thinking. And the takeaway, because I've listened to Chinese versions of the same story, and the takeaway that Xi Jinping got was, wow, this is a man who is very decisive. And if it's in the interest of the United States to do something, he will do whatever it takes. And remember what I said just a minute ago about the Chinese respect strength. And so that kind of timber, if you like, went into Xi Jinping's thinking, and he took that back to Beijing, and they absorbed that in terms of how the United States responds. So when it came a year or so later to Korea, and Trump calls up Xi Jinping and says, we got a serious problem with this Korean dictator on your border, and we're thinking that we may have to take him out. What is Xi Jinping thinking? Lunchtime, missile strikes. Wow, Trump is pretty serious. I better do something about the Korean dictator. So that show of force translated into action and a response on the Chinese side that they understood. The Democratic administrations we've seen, and the Biden administration being along the same flow, doesn't have that same sort of strength built into it. So,
well, especially when you got hooks in you, over decades,
Right. So yeah, that's a big difference, and that's the difference, of course, that Trump made even compared to a lot of our Republican presidents.
Yeah. Well, this has been fascinating. We could go on for quite a while, but we've run out of time for this session. We're going to have to go to part 2 so that we can dig further in, James. But this is awesome. I appreciate you taking the time, and I'm glad you're in the United States and not over there dining with the Chinese, and you're helping us over here now.
Yeah, I am too, and it's great to be connected with you. We should talk also about the World Economic Forum, the Davos gang, and the Great Reset, the Great Global Reset that they have planned, because that's a whole nother topic.
Yes, we just were on a call yesterday where someone works at high levels like yourself was talking about the World Economic Forum and their agenda and their goal. So that's another good topic. Maybe the 3 of us should be on for that. So
maybe we could just talk walk by faith stories too. I got a bundle of them, and so do you. So
all right, James. Well, thanks so much, and we'll see you next time. God bless.
Bless you. Thank you so much. Thank you for the time.
Let's face it, we all want to make a difference. We want to live for Christ. We want our work to have meaning deep down. We all want to live a larger story to make a difference in the world. But how do we do this? It doesn't just happen. We must invest in our spiritual and professional life that involves spiritual mentoring and training. But where do we go to get that kind of spiritual mentoring and professional training? Is it at church, a conference, a school? The Change Agent Master Mentor Program is the answer to that question, founded by Hillman. He is a pioneer in marketplace ministry and has had a 40-year advertising and business career, working with clients like American Express, Steinway Pianos, Thomas Nelson Publishers, and a host of other successful companies. He understands the challenge of living for Christ in a pressure-packed business environment. He created the Change Agent Master Mentor Program to help leaders. Us will help you realize your dream of being successful in your career and having an influence on your world. The Change Agent Master Mentor Program is designed for you to realize your larger story, to understand your purpose, to learn and apply your faith life to your work life from us and other proven workspace leaders who are doing it. Our online course and group mentoring will help you become God's change agent, to be a cultural influencer and succeed in your work-life call, and grow in your relationship with God and with other members of the Change Agent Master Mentor Program. Come join us. Let's influence the world together. www.camastermentor.com